Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm one of your hosts, Derick, and with me today is Evan. Good day, sir.
How are you doing, sir?
Not too bad. Let's dive right in. We're finally past the opening story of the Bible, some 30 odd episodes in,
Fantastic.
and we're on to story number two, which frankly might take another 30 odd episodes. So let's
Excellent.
let's begin looking at the story of Adam and Eve. And so this, I've been reading various takes on this quite a bit now, and this is the story of Adam and Eve itself is one thing, but the history of humanity's interaction with this story is an utterly fascinating thing to follow and uncover. And I think that's because, frankly, when you look at the story of Adam and Eve itself, it's actually incredibly sparse on detail. There's a lot of things that you would think could be included as surrounding detail and information that would flesh out the story quite a bit. It's just not there, not at all. Nothing is said of it, and we'll look at some details of that in a little bit here, but as a result of the sparseness of that story, humanity's developed a rich history of retelling the story of Adam and Eve, but often adding bits of detail that don't appear at all in the original tale. And one of the ways people would be familiar with this is there's a lot of Jewish retellings and expansions of the story of Adam and Eve. There's the Book of Jubilees is one. There's the Jewish midrashic tradition, which will have retellings of it. And if you look just at Jewish commentary, rabbinic commentary over the millennia at this point, there's a lot of retellings of it with additional details. But Christianity as well, honestly, has a very similar tradition, not perhaps as explicitly retelling the story, but the commentary that exists does have quite a bit added to it often, or there's inferences made that frankly don't have to be made at all. But Christianity, oddly enough, too, I think actually draws a fair bit of their understanding of the story of Adam and Eve from perhaps the most famous retelling of the story, which is Paradise Lost by John Milton. And we're not going to go into detail on that here right now, but perhaps when we're done with Adam and Eve, we may look at Paradise Lost by Milton, see if that's worth doing an episode on. We may do an episode on some of the other versions, I guess, of the tale as well, if that's something you're interested in. And if you are interested in, by the way, hit us up with a comment or send us an email, unschooltheology@protonmail.com. Let us know if you'd be interested in that kind of thing as well. And since we're talking about that, I may as well just throw this in now, because we do this as a video show and as a podcast. Potentially, if you have interest in us doing an episode on some of the art that has been inspired by this particular tale over the years, we could potentially do something like that as well, because there's quite a bit there to explore.
There's a lot of
fact,
that.
Yeah, and in fact, the art in particular contains a lot of extra detail that's not there, right? Because again, the story is sparse, and if you're going to create an image of a story that is so sparse on detail, you're going to have to, add some components to it. And just why those things are there is interesting, and are certainly tell us the interpretive perspective of the artist.
My favorite is what did Eve eat and what did Adam eat? And
right.
Typically the response is apple.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, it was fruit. Mm-hmm. There's no specific detail as to what fruit actually was eaten. And so just small things that somehow sit in people's consciousness, that tiny details added, which seems And maybe an apple in of itself is harmless, but when retelling of stories, you are naturally going to change things and add things, and that can adjust people's interpretation. I think that's why it's significant to point this out.
So, and that alone actually is interesting, the apple thing, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
one of the things uh, I think this story does is it exposes something about ourselves, what additions to it we make.
Yeah.
It kind of reveals something about ourselves. And now, again, the apple, that might be a minor thing, but is there you're familiar with the idea of Plato's theory of forms, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there's this idealistic version of a thing, and is an apple like the closest thing we have to the idealistic version of a fruit? Is that why we've replaced fruit with apple? Is that
Yeah.
what we have or something? I don't know.
Yeah, or it
Um,
being an image of temptation. I mean, it's used as an image of temptation in other
mhm,
fairy tales. I think of Disney films. I can't remember
right.
exactly what film it is, but an apple is
Snow
used.
White.
Snow White used as
Yeah.
an image of the poison apple.
Mhm.
And so it's like, well, that connects in our minds to something else. And so, I mean, naturally, these have to both be the same idea.
Yeah.
And
Or I
if you,
assume, or maybe the apple was used in Snow White because of the history that had
oh, the
developed,
history, it could have been that.
in
Yeah,
Adam and
that's
Eve.
true.
Who knows how these things overlap? But the fact that we settle on an apple and not a grape is curious.
Yeah, or a
You know,
banana or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Um, yeah, it's odd. It's odd.
I mean, obviously, an apple is probably more widely available than other fruits, but
Maybe in
it's
Europe, maybe in Europe in the time when it's developing, it's like, well,
yeah,
I
when
don't know.
it's
I don't
when
know.
the
I don't
art
know
is
the
being developed and whatnot. I know, because in the Middle East you'd think fig, maybe,
yeah, exactly. It
or
would be
something like
something
that. So
else.
yeah, yeah, it's curious. But anyway, so uh, again, what we want to look at this story, what in particular leads to this sort of relationship, and it's the lack of detail. And we are storytelling creatures as humans, and we have robust imaginations. So if you
Mhm.
give us a story that lacks detail, we naturally fill in the rest with our imaginations.
Mhm.
And so the the story of Adam and Eve, one of the ways I look at it is that it's almost a window into our own relationship with sin. There's a part of me that looks at the lack of detail and says, is that purposeful? Right? Is it done that way? You could argue, well, maybe it's that those details don't matter and our interpretation of the story should disregard all of those details. And that's one of the things we're going to attempt to do, is look at it with as little added as possible. But then you could make the case that actually maybe the fact that we can add our own details to it, that makes this story a way that we can uncover our own relationships with sin and the ways in which we fall victim to sin. For instance, one of the more well-known examples of this would be Augustine, right? Augustine had periods of promiscuity in his life. He spent 13 years with a mistress with whom he had a child but never married. And he, in this story, saw a central role for sexuality.
Mhm.
That's not in there at all, except for maybe one line of cleaving onto one another. That is about it. And even then it's like, well, there's a number of ways you could interpret that or look at that. And
Mhm.
Augustine reads in there quite a bit, right? To the idea of the and they shall become one flesh, and he makes that a central focus in this story. And maybe that's what it's about, or maybe that's what it was about for him, because that was where a lot of his particular relationship with sin stemmed from. Or, for instance, another example that I find interesting is there's a lot of preachers and commentators who, I think if you were to talk to them, they would very much claim, right, that they are absolutely not adding anything to the text. They would never do such a thing, right? They would recoil at this idea of adding something to the text. But then you listen to them preaching, and I've heard things like, I've heard it suggested that Adam had been standing by Eve for the entire discussion with the serpent, and so, but he failed to intervene, and so that was really Adam's fault, that happened. There's nothing in the text to suggest where Adam was at the time. Nothing. Maybe he was there, maybe he wasn't. It gives us no indication whatsoever. Or oftentimes I've heard it said that Eve and Adam, they're trying to pass blame when God asks them what happened after they ate the fruit. But if you look at the words that they say, God asked them what happened, and they simply repeat what happened. They never said it was so-and-so's fault. Mm-hmm. They just simply say, well, the woman who you gave to me here gave me the fruit and I ate it. That's what happened. Which, by the way, is exactly what happened, And Eve says, well, the serpent tricked me and I ate it, which is exactly what happened, right? You could read into that it's passing blame if you want to, or you could read into that as it's almost just a mechanistic, here's exactly what happened. They're certainly not showing remorse there. They're not apologizing for having done that. But to say that they're passing blame is to add something to the text that's not there. And I've heard that one a lot from, in particular, preachers and commentators who I think would very much say, no, I'm not adding anything to it, right?
What in that context they're doing is they're adding italics. They're adding the woman who you gave to me.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then the serpent is the one who tricked me. Mm-hmm. And it's not evident that it comes down with that. With those italics attached to it.
Yeah, and that's the key, right? In both the cases that I talked about here, they're making an interpretive choice to infer something from the text that does not directly state, right? Mm-hmm. And that to me is perhaps that is how the story is meant to be understood. Maybe, I don't know. Or maybe it's exposing something about their own tendencies, in terms of their relationship with sin. Mm-hmm. Perhaps if you read that into the story, I don't know, maybe you're the type of person who has a tendency to pass blame. Most of us humans do. So it sort of makes sense that we would kind of see that in there as, oh, they were passing blame. And I know that because I know that's what I would have done in that situation, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people who absolutely that would have been the case. So one of the keys here to the story of Adam and Eve here is that it is a story that I think, frankly, forces you to make choices. It's so sparse on detail, and it requires, or let's put it this way, it sustains many different interpretive techniques. Mm-hmm. And because of that, it requires you to make some sort of choice about what you're doing, right? And when a story is as multi-layered as this, yet still skeletal, which is a fascinating combination, it becomes necessary for some sort of greater context to be added for the story to really make sense, right? It just, this story requires that. If you were to put this story on its own and not in the Bible, it would be a story not worth reading almost. It's just like, well, what does any of this mean? Now, in the context of the Bible, now it's extremely meaningful. But it's a story that is extremely dependent upon greater context. So in that light of the necessity to make choices, we could choose to examine the choices that we're making in terms of our interpretation and try to be as aware of them as we possibly can. The issue, though, is that requires us to admit that the detail given to us in the Bible is too minimal for us to really draw any universal application from it on its own. So that's one of the approaches. And that's, for a lot of people, I think that might be difficult for people to accept, the idea that, well, the Bible didn't give you enough information here. But again, maybe that's actually the design of the story. Maybe that's the point. Maybe that's why it's so sparse, is that the Bible is forcing us to make those choices, right? Go ahead.
I oftentimes think it's I see this issue present in the modern age of the internet when it comes to people who are who are bold enough to try to give advice generally. I don't know if you've noticed this tendency, but you see people who will say, like, who will say things that that is a broad form of advice and then extend like 10 caveats.
Yeah.
And say, like, you need to get your life together. But obviously, I'm not telling you that it's not possible that you've had disadvantages in life. And I'm obviously not telling you that you should brutalize yourself or that you should be perfectionist or that you should be like that tendency shows up all the time. And so when it comes to extending some type of that's advice, but the point of this story is I think intended to be to enrich us, to help us better understand the world in which we live and how we're intended to navigate it.
And ourselves.
And ourselves, exactly. So it's advice, not really, but it's in the form of a story. It seems that unless you're tending to, in order to reach broad applicability, it's very difficult to do that without having 1,000 caveats. I mean, if you're talking to history, to humanity spread out across history and across geography, you're ending up in probably the millions in terms of caveats that you're having to extend. Or you establish something that is very, very sparse, but has, because of that sparseness, the capability of being applied in multiple different contexts.
Right.
I think that might be what's going on here.
I think that's true. Again, though, I think there are those who take the stories of the Bible very historically in nature, for whom that becomes difficult, right? Because if this is a historical recounting of a moment, and we're going to explore this issue a little further, actually, the next episode. But if this is a historical recounting of a moment, then what right do you have to add anything to it, right? Which is why there are a set of preachers and commentators who would recoil at the thought that they have added something. Yet indeed they have, the emphasis on, well, this was passing blame, even though it might just simply be reviewing the facts of what happened.
And I think the Augustine example is more robust in terms of interpreting the sin as sexual sin,
right?
Because that number one had a lot of influence, and also is such a stretch, and so clearly influenced by his own experience.
Yes.
So the story then does become something of a as you've suggested, a measuring stick for us to better understand ourselves.
Right. So with all that in mind, as we're about to examine it ourselves, it's going to require a number of choices regarding our interpretive approach, right? And how we are going to handle the selective sparseness of this particular tale. So the next few episodes, that's kind of what we're going to cover here. We're going to cover a couple of the choices that we're making heading into our discussion of this. Not to say that these are the only choices one might make, not even to say that these are the correct choices to make. I don't know, right? That's sort of the issue, is we're kind of forced into making those choices. So I want to review what those choices are and at least the reasoning behind it. And then, if you make different choices in your interpretation, so be it. Who's to say who's correct in this? You can't say in a way. However, our goal, broadly speaking, is really going to aim to be as unbiased and impartial and neutral in terms of our approach not going as far as Augustine, that kind of a way. That said, there's a good chance we'll fail because it seems that everyone who's undertaken this task has failed before. So I imagine we'll fail in our own unique way, and perhaps that reveals something about us. But yeah, so at best here, I think the hope is mostly just let's show you another way that we might extract something of value, right? Something of meaning from this story based on here's a set of choices that can be made, and here's what emerges from that, right? So that'll be the next few episodes, I guess. The next handful of episodes will cover some of those choices, including perhaps the biggest one, even though maybe it shouldn't be, and we'll get into that more next time, the question of a historical atom. So we'll examine that next episode. But yeah, until then, like, subscribe, follow, check us out, Unschooltheology at protonmail.com, and we'll see you then.